As they got closer, the men saw that the object was not just trash. It was wrapped in cloth, with a cardboard box visible on the outside, and there were signs of damage. An hour later, the police were already working on the pier. When the contents of the box were removed, it became clear. The body of a woman had been found. It was wrapped in bedding, secured with tape, and it was impossible to immediately identify it. The solution was not intuition, not documents, which were missing, but the serial number of a medical implant found in the body. Barbara died from multiple stab wounds, inflicted with particular cruelty. The expert concluded the attack was chaotic but protracted. She resisted. It was a murder committed in rage or panic. Dear viewers, in the next video releases, you will find very intriguing and confusing cases, and in order not to miss them, be sure to subscribe to the channel and please like the video. Barbara Ann Mullenix was born in the late 1940s in a quiet coastal town in California. She came into the world in a family with strong traditions. Her father was a World War II veteran, strict but fair, and her mother was a housewife whose life revolved around home and raising children. Barbara grew up in an era when women had far fewer choices, but she showed an independent spirit from childhood. She understood early on that in order to achieve her goals, she would have to rely only on herself. As a child, Barbara showed an adult curiosity. She easily memorized information, loved to read, and often set up impromptu libraries in her bedroom from books that she took from the local library. Her teachers noted her as a capable and thoughtful student. Albeit with a certain stubbornness, she did not tolerate injustice, and was not afraid to argue with adults if she felt that she was right. Even then, she combined the traits that would later become defining in her character: keen intuition, emotional closeness, and internal discipline. As a teenager, Barbara increasingly clashed with her parents. She was not satisfied with the role of the perfect daughter. She wanted freedom, independence, and control over her own destiny. At 17, she secretly applied to college in Los Angeles and, having received a scholarship, packed her things and left without asking permission. This act became a turning point in her life. She began a path in which she relied only on herself. In Los Angeles, Barbara studied at the Faculty of Journalism. She was interested in the truth, in all its manifestations. She dreamed of becoming a war correspondent, to talk about what others were afraid to see. But the city, as often happens, changed her. Instead of editorial offices and business trips, she was drawn into the stormy atmosphere of Southern California in the 70s. Parties, new acquaintances, street philosophers, protests against the war, student marches. Barbara learned to be strong among the strong, and to hide weakness behind irony. It was during this period that she met her future husband, a charismatic graduate student in philosophy named Bruce. Their relationship developed rapidly. They were different. He was reasonable, balanced, prone to long reflections. She was emotional, impulsive, capable of abruptly changing course without explanation. They were united by a passion for ideas, books, and nightly conversations in which they argued about the meaning of life, freedom, and personal responsibility. 2 years after they met, they got married. Barbara, not yet having completed her studies, took an academic leave, and soon they had a son, Alex. With the birth of the child, Barbara changed. She became more withdrawn, focused on family and home. Her ambitions gave way to motherhood, but she was never able to completely dissolve into everyday life. A few years after Alex was born, Barbara returned to school and then began working, first at a local newspaper, then at an advertising agency. She quickly gained authority in each team. She was respected for her straightforwardness, sharp mind, and ability to work with people. But colleagues also noticed Barbara had two faces. One was smiling, sociable, diplomatic. The other was cold, distant, and sometimes even harsh. Switching between them happened instantly, and this frightened those who knew her superficially. Family life with Bruce gradually began to crack. He began to go on business trips more and more often, went into science, while Barbara demanded that he be more involved in everyday life. She felt that she was losing control, and for her this was unacceptable. When Alex went to elementary school, the couple decided to divorce. Barbara insisted on full custody, arguing that her father was too distant to be an active parent. The divorce was a heavy blow, but it did not break her. On the contrary, Barbara seemed even more collected and determined. She moved to Orange County, got a job in an administrative position at a law firm, and soon bought her own 2-room apartment. There, in a quiet area with palm trees and neat lawns, she began to build a new life. A few years later, fate took another sharp turn. Barbara became pregnant from a casual affair, and her daughter Rachel was born. The relationship with the girl's father was fleeting, and he almost immediately disappeared from the family's life. Barbara was left alone again, but this time she was ready. She raised Rachel with almost fanatical devotion. The girl always looked neat, danced, sang in a choir, went to summer camps. Her mother monitored her surroundings, controlled her leisure time, assessed her friends, and intervened if she felt threatened. Those around her called this overprotection, love with an iron fist. Barbara was multifaceted. At the office, she was respected for her efficiency and attention to detail. At home, she was a strict but caring mother. Neighbors recalled that she never took part in street parties and kept to herself, but always nodded affably when she made eye contact. Those who knew her better spoke of her as a woman with deep inner fears. She was afraid of old age, loneliness, loss of control. Therefore, her house was always perfectly clean, everything was in its place, and even the books on the shelves were arranged alphabetically. Sometimes, in rare moments of candor, Barbara would tell how she dreamed of becoming a writer, of creating her own novel, a psychological thriller about a woman whose life is like an iceberg. Order on the surface, an abyss deep down. But work, children, everyday life, all this crowded out her ambitions. She transferred her need for control to the world around her, to her children, to her colleagues, to her image. It became a way to cope with anxiety. As Rachel grew older, the tension between them began to grow. Barbara did not accept the idea that her daughter was a separate person. She saw her as an extension of herself, a project that needed to be realized. But Rachel grew up completely different, open, emotional, prone to rebellion. In high school, they increasingly had conflicts about clothes, friends, the choice of college. Barbara did not tolerate objections, and the more Rachel distanced herself, the more harshly her mother tried to hold her back. Despite her external well-being, a stable job, a well-kept home, a comfortable life, Barbara was tired. Tired of the endless struggle for control. By the age of 50, her life was a carefully constructed structure. Everything in its place, everything under control, everything on the verge of emotional tension. It seemed that just a little bit more, and the fragile balance would collapse. But no one knew about it. Not colleagues, not neighbors, not even close ones. Barbara knew how to hide her inner anxiety behind a mask of confidence. Her figure was always in order, her hair was neatly styled, her makeup was impeccable. Even on weekends, she did not allow herself to relax. There were no accidents in her life, only order, rules, and cold calculation. She lived the way she knew how. Not always happily, not always gently, but always with effort, as if she was constantly trying to prove to the world that she could cope on her own. A woman from the past, forever balancing between the role of an ideal mother and secret fears that no one knew about. And no one could have guessed how this story would end. The summer of 2006 in Southern California was especially hot and tense in every sense. Temperatures soared above normal, smoke from small fires hung in the streets, and family conflicts smoldered in stuffy apartments like embers that you can't see until the flames flare up. In Barbara Mullenix's Huntington Beach apartment, the air was especially thick. Not because of the weather, but because there was too much unsaid, too much irritation, too many unspoken grievances. Barbara was 56 years old at the time. Behind her was a divorce, 2 adult career attempts, 2 children by different men, and a life that she had built herself, year after year, brick by brick. Her eldest son, Alex, had long since separated from her. Contact with him had gradually faded to nothing. Travel, arguments, misunderstandings. Now all Barbara's energy was focused on Rachel, her only daughter, her project, her pride, her vulnerability. Rachel was 19 at the time. She had finished school and, despite her mother's reminders, was in no hurry to go to college. When asked, "What are you going to do with your life?" she shrugged. She was interested in other things: parties, music, friends, and especially one person who made Barbara feel physically ill, a young man named Ian. Tall, withdrawn, with gray eyes, an eternally tired look, and a tattoo on his neck. He seemed to Barbara to be the embodiment of everything she was trying to protect her daughter from: lack of initiative, unsettled, unpredictable. But for Rachel, he was a breath of fresh air. She, who grew up in a house where everything was on a ruler and feelings were regulated by a strict tone, saw in Ian not danger, but freedom. Ian was several years older than Rachel. He worked sporadically, lived in rented rooms, moved often. He didn't try to please. He behaved distantly, almost indifferently. And that was precisely what attracted her. Every time Rachel brought him home, Barbara felt an alarm go off inside her. She couldn't accept him. In her world, everything had to have an explanation, a status, a plan. And this young man was chaos in human form. The relationship between mother and daughter began to deteriorate. At first, there were minor jabs, reproaches for sloppiness, comments about appearance, demands to return home on time. Then, open quarrels. Rachel began to avoid communication, lingering on the streets, spending the night with friends. Barbara responded with ultimatums. "If you live in this house, follow my rules." In Rachel's eyes, her mother was no longer an example. She had become a supervisor, and with each passing day, this role repelled her more and more. Soon, the argument went beyond words. Barbara tried to forbid Rachel from communicating with Ian, to forbid her from using the internet, to limit her mobile. She tried to regain control again, as in childhood, but she did not understand. Her daughter was no longer a child, and she, in turn, began to respond not with protest, but with coldness. An invisible but dense wall grew between them. The houses where evening conversations used to be heard were now filled with silence. Mutual fatigue grew. Each side felt like a victim. Each considered itself right. The neighbors began to notice the changes. Barbara, who used to be smiling, now looked askance. Rachel, on the contrary, began to leave the house more often, sit on a bench near the entrance, talk on the phone for a long time, sometimes in tears. The couple from the neighboring house, who lived on the floor above, recalled how one night they heard a muffled female scream. It was not loud, not panicky, but desperate. They thought it was just a family scene and did not intervene. As incidentally, no one else intervened. After all, from the outside, everything did not look so dramatic. Barbara increasingly came to work later than usual. She began to look tired, haggard. Her colleagues assumed that she was ill. She answered questions briefly. "Nothing. It will pass." On some days, she forgot important documents, mixed up dates. For a woman whose work schedule was always a model of precision, this looked strange. One of the employees said that she was worried about her daughter. But no one expected how out of control the situation had gotten. Meanwhile, Rachel spent more and more time with Ian. They dreamed of escaping, going anywhere, to another state, to another city, to a place where there were no rules and no one asked unnecessary questions. Sometimes, according to friends, they discussed the details as if they were playing out a scenario, how it would happen, who would take what, how they would get there. It seemed like just a teenage fantasy. But something in their eyes, especially Ian's, said that for them, this was more than just a game. August turned to September, and the tension reached a boiling point. Barbara, according to the recordings on the answering machine, tried to negotiate with her daughter. Her voice was restrained, but taut, like a string ready to snap. "Rachel, we need to talk. Don't drag it out. I'm tired of this shadow of war." This was the last voice message that investigators later heard, and a few days later, Barbara simply disappeared. Her co-workers were the first to sound the alarm. She didn't show up for work. She didn't call. She didn't warn anyone. The phone was turned off. No one answered her home calls. The neighbor downstairs noticed that no one had turned on the lights in the apartment since the evening. But no official police report was filed. Too little time had passed. too much speculation. Rachel, who was finally reached by phone, said that Mom went away for a couple of days to recharge. That's how she explained her absence, and she added, "Don't worry, she's just tired." 3 days passed, and everything remained the same. No calls, no letters, no signal. During this same period, a few miles from Huntington Beach in the Newport Beach Harbor area, early in the morning, 2 fishermen who were out on the water looking for grouper noticed a strange object in the water. It was drifting not far from the shore, caught in the seaweed. At first they thought it was trash, an old blanket, or a bag lowered from a boat. Then there was a thick smell. Something about it was alarming. As they got closer, the men saw that the object wasn't just trash. It was wrapped in cloth, with a cardboard box visible on the outside, and it showed signs of damage. They called the Coast Guard. An hour later, the police were already working on the pier. When the contents of the box were removed, it became clear the body of a woman had been found. It was wrapped in bedding, secured with tape, and it was impossible to immediately identify her. It took less than a day for forensic scientists to determine who it was. The solution was not brought by intuition, not by documents that were missing, but by the serial number of a medical implant found in the body. This technical detail allowed them to identify the deceased. It was Barbara Ann Mullenix, 56, who lived in Huntington Beach. A woman who, according to her daughter, just decided to go away for a little vacation. For investigators from the Newport Beach Police Department, this call initially did not seem out of the ordinary. Bodies are occasionally found in coastal areas, most often accidents, sometimes suicides. But this case was not one of their standard protocols. The packaging of the body itself was sloppy but labor-intensive. The use of household materials such as tape and bed linens. The unnatural position of the body. Whoever got rid of the remains was either in a hurry or inexperienced, or acted emotionally, under the influence of strong internal pressure. The first task facing the investigation was to establish the identity. Fingerprints did not give a result, but at the morgue, while examining the body, the pathologist noticed a medical implant. It was a relatively rare type of breast prosthesis, on the internal capsule of which there was a unique serial number. This number was used to contact the manufacturer, and then to the clinic where the operation was performed. Thus, the woman's name became officially known: Barbara Ann Mullenix. Now the Huntington Beach police entered the case. According to internal logic, the first step was to visit the deceased's place of residence. The task force arrived at the address where Barbara lived, accompanied by a court warrant. Visually, everything looked calm. The doors were locked, the blinds were lowered, there were no signs of disorder outside. However, inside the apartment greeted the investigators with an uneasy silence and a subtle, barely perceptible atmosphere of an interrupted life. On the kitchen table lay unpaid bills, dated recent dates. In the sink, an unwashed cup with the remains of tea. The bedroom was partially dismantled. The bed was missing a sheet. The pillows were unsymmetrical. The mattress was shifted. On the floor, several stains, which at first glance looked like spilled juice, but the consistency and color aroused suspicion. Investigators seized material for analysis. Scanners showed traces of biological fluids. Later, the lab confirmed it was blood. Not just stains, but clear traces of an attempt to wash it off. A forensic team was called in. More became visible under ultraviolet light. Marks on the wall, a carpet on which something heavy had clearly been spilled, even shoe prints leading to the bathroom. There, investigators found torn fabric, scraps of gray tape, and a plastic bag with hairs left in it. They were also sent for DNA testing. Even then, it became clear. The murder did not take place on the water or somewhere along the road. It took place in this house, in her own bedroom. The next task was to determine who had access to the apartment and when exactly Barbara was last seen. Employees of the company where she worked confirmed that she had last contacted on September 9th. From that moment on, there was complete silence. Her mobile did not answer. No one received any letters or calls from her. This was the approximate date around which they began to build a chronology. The key element was that her daughter, Rachel, was still living in the apartment. By the time the body was discovered, she was no longer in the house, and this immediately raised questions for the investigators. Where was she? Why did she disappear at the same time as her mother? Why didn't she report her missing? These questions needed to be answered immediately. They were only able to contact her through her father, Bruce Mullenix, Barbara's ex-husband. He lived separately, in another county, and was traveling at the time of the events. The police questioned him, and he was surprised to report that he had not spoken to his ex-wife for several months, but that Rachel had indeed called him recently. According to her, she and Ian had gone on a trip to get some fresh air, to change the scenery. There was no alarm in the conversation, but in retrospect, he remembered. His daughter's voice was tense, as if she was reading a prepared text. The police immediately put Rachel and Ian on the wanted list. Credit card tracking systems were activated via a partner database, and within 24 hours it became known that the couple had appeared in Louisiana. They rented a motel, used a card in Ian's name, made small purchases, water, snacks, cash. They were detained at a gas station. They did not resist. The first interrogation took place in the presence of lawyers. Rachel insisted that she had nothing to do with her mother's disappearance. She claimed that she was emotionally unstable, often said that she needed to disappear, and could have simply left. According to her, the night before her disappearance they had an argument, after which Barbara left the apartment and never returned. It was a subtle but noticeable move, to absolve herself of responsibility by leaving a loophole. However, the investigation already had evidence that cast doubt on her words. Firstly, the surveillance camera installed in the car park near the house recorded two people approaching Barbara's car late at night, figures similar in height and build to Rachel and Ian. They were carrying packages and loading them into the trunk. This happened at about 2 in the morning, several hours after the presumed time of death. The camera did not record faces, but the clothes and gait were studied by experts, and they almost certainly stated these were Rachel and her boyfriend. Secondly, traces of Rachel's DNA were found on things found in the apartment. A pillow, a piece of a sheet, even scraps of tape. And not just presents, but contact traces indicating interaction with the materials used to pack the body. Investigators concluded Rachel, at the very least, helped get rid of the body, and most likely, she was present at the crime. Meanwhile, Ian behaved coldly and detachedly. During the interrogation, he remained silent for a long time, and then stated that things didn't go to plan. He said that the conflict between Barbara and Rachel had reached its climax, that at some point everything had gotten out of control, that he was trying to protect Rachel. In this version, he portrayed himself as a savior, not a killer. But his story was full of gaps. An important role was played by the correspondence between Rachel and Ian, recovered from her phone. There were messages sent several days before Barbara's disappearance. They discussed taking a big step, getting rid of the problem, starting a new life. These messages were not direct confessions, but in the context of what was happening, they sounded threatening. One of the investigators would later say, "At this stage it became clear this was not an impulsive crime. It was not planned in detail, but they had clearly discussed the scenario in advance. And yet, despite the evidence was circumstantial, and the prosecution knew it had to be enough to convince the jury of premeditation." An important step was examining the laptop seized from Ian. The browser history revealed search queries made weeks before the crime. How to dispose of a body, death and punishment in California, police jurisdiction zones, cardboard boxes for packing furniture. These queries were not made on the day of the crime. They were a sign of preparation. All the evidence began to fit together. A family conflict, attempts to escape, pressure, talk of a new life, then the disappearance, the discovery of the body, traces at the crime scene, escape, false explanations, digital traces, and, finally, clumsy attempts to build an alternative version of events. By the time the investigation had completed the bulk of its work, there was already enough ground for prosecution. The prosecution was preparing the case for trial. The main thing was to find out who killed Barbara Mullenix, why, and what role her own daughter and the man she called the love of her life played in it. The Orange County courtroom was packed. Reporters, courtroom artists, locals, and the curious crowded the gallery. hoping to witness the denouement of one of the darkest family dramas ever to unfold. It's not every day that a young woman finds herself in the dock accused of murdering her mother. Even rarer is the young lover with whom she allegedly planned the crime. The public wanted an explanation, the prosecution wanted a verdict, and the defense wanted some kind of doubt. The prosecution had brought a charge of first-degree murder with particular cruelty. During the preliminary hearing, the prosecutor said, "This is not an impulse. This is not a tragedy. This is an act of deliberate, calculated violence. Young people who had everything, an education, a roof over their heads, love, chose betrayal and blood in return." He emphasized that the case was centered on control, manipulation, and the desire to free oneself from someone who was interfering. And if there was no fair punishment, it would set a dangerous precedent. The defense, in turn, tried to build a completely different picture. Rachel's lawyers insisted that she was impressionable and under psychological pressure from Ian Allen. He allegedly isolated her, instilled ideas about freedom, about a new life, and gradually turned her against her mother. "She's not a murderer," the defense said. "She's a victim of a manipulator who wanted to be loved. He instilled in her that her mother was an enemy." This was the main line of defense. However, the jury listened to more than just speeches. They examined evidence. And there was a lot of it. The court was provided with correspondence between Ian and Rachel, in which they discussed quarrels with their mother, dissatisfaction with her lifestyle, and hints at radical measures. A transcript of the text messages from the day before the murder was also read, in which Rachel wrote, "I hope you're here when it all starts. I can't live without you." These lines caused a deathly silence in the courtroom. The court heard evidence from a forensic pathologist who confirmed that Barbara died from multiple stab wounds inflicted with particular cruelty. The expert concluded that the attack was chaotic but protracted. She resisted. It was not a quick death, and not remote. It was a murder committed in rage or panic. Also shown was a video from a gas station in Louisiana, where a few days after the crime, a camera captured Rachel and Ian. They were smiling, eating snacks, joking at the checkout. This contrast, between the moment after the brutal murder and their relaxed behavior, astounded the jury. The prosecutor asked, "Is this what remorse looks like? Or is this the cold, indifferent reaction of a man who has already decided that he got away with it?" Ian's lawyer, in turn, tried to convince the court that his client did not plan the murder. Allegedly, everything happened by chance. The conflict turned into a fight. He intervened to protect Rachel. But again, the evidence did not match this version. The layout of the apartment, the traces of the struggle, the timing of the events, everything indicated that the attack began suddenly and was prepared in advance. In addition, traces of Barbara's blood remained on his clothes, seized after the arrest, despite attempts to wash them. The key moment was the questioning of Rachel herself. She was called to court, and under oath she told her version of events. Her voice trembled, but the words sounded rehearsed. "I didn't want to do this. I asked him not to do it. I thought we would just leave. I thought Mum would let us go. I didn't know he was capable of such a thing." She portrayed herself as a frightened daughter drawn into tragedy. But on cross-examination, the prosecutor caught her in a contradiction. "If you didn't know he was capable of this, why did you help bag the body the next day and dump it in Newport Beach Harbor? Why didn't you go to the police? Why did you run away with him?" There was no answer. Only silence. Only tears. But the jury had already begun to form an opinion. After weeks of hearings, witnesses, and evidence, sentencing day arrived. The jury was tense to the point of breaking point. The jury returned with a verdict after 8 hours of deliberation. Rachel Mullenix, guilty of first-degree murder. Ian Allen, guilty of first-degree murder. Their faces were almost expressionless, as if they knew there was no other outcome. The judge sentenced Rachel to 25 years without the possibility of parole. The court took into account her age and the influence of her senior partner. Ian Allen, then 21, was given life without parole. In his closing remarks, the judge said, "You both took life. Coldly, methodically. You had the opportunity to stop, but you went all the way. Today is the price you pay for that choice. It is justice that may not bring back the dead woman, but it will put an end to this brutal tragedy.